Our first item of business will be requests for bill introductions. And I'm going to start us off with a RS 0703. And that is a bill that would limit caseloads. And are there any questions? Any objections? Okay, seeing none, we will request the introduction. And the other one is RS 0514, and that is regarding the Office of the Child Advocate. Any questions? Any objection? Okay, we'll make those requests from the committee. Any others from the committee? Any bill requests from our guests? All righty, we'll get right into, we're doing several reports today. And so we're going to start off with Rachel Marsh doing a roadmap of foster care. We've kind of, Representative Powerton.
Madam Chair, before we get started, could you clarify, I know we're paperless, so are we on the S drive or are we on the Kansas Legislature website? Sorry?
It's on both.
It's on both. Okay, perfect.
It's on both, yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, Rachel, welcome to committee. So a while back, when we were like first couple of meetings, had asked for a kind of a flow chart of how foster care works and just kind of a basic visual. And so I asked Rachel to, if she could put something together for us. So here we are.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Kincannon, Vice Chair Johnson, Ranking Member Ousley, and members of the committee. My name is Rachel Marsh. I'm with the Children's Alliance of Kansas, and we have tried to put together some simplified sort of points of reference. And because it was in multiple documents, we've shared a file with you. So if you don't want to be on your computers, you can follow along on the documents in your file. So normally I would tell you a little bit about the Children's Alliance to start any testimony. In today's packet, I have included a list of our member agencies, and that's the first list. The reason I've tried to share that is that when I stand before you, I think it's important that you understand that the Alliance is representative of such a wide, diverse network of family and services providers across the state of Kansas. We have providers that focus very upfront in the system on prevention and prevention of foster care. We have providers that work primarily and solely with the goal of recruiting and retaining foster parents. We have providers that do case management work in foster care and adoption. And we also have members that advocate when called for the support of foster parents when they find themselves in a conflict with a case management decision. Finally, we represent residential providers and psychiatric residential care facilities. And so when we do bring an issue before you, we just wanted to share that a little bit more about the Children's Alliance, that it's been vetted through a network of providers that represent service providers in every county and community in Kansas from a child welfare perspective, but it's not always a uniform and unilateral child welfare perspective. So my next handout is called Partnering Together, the Kansas Child Welfare Wellbeing System. And so I want to point out that the title, the Kansas Child Wellbeing System, is a new title that we're trying to use in what we've always called child welfare. And I will easily revert to child welfare because I've been working in child welfare for 20 years. But we are trying to get child well-being to be the new phrase. So you may see it interchangeably. What this handout kind of tries to outline every major player, but not every player. If I did every player, we'd have an 80-page document. So every major player includes the Kansas Department of Children and Families, the Kansas Department of Disability and Aging Services, and the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, because they are over the different funding silos that come from our federal government that impact foster youth directly. So DCF has the Title IV-E funding for traditional child welfare services. Excuse me, and the KDADs and KDHE, they are the Medicaid providers. And children, when they enter foster care, they have access to Medicaid. So the Medicaid policies of our state are critically important in making sure that foster children access the health care and specifically mental health care services that they need. So going on from there, we have the judicial branch. I've included just a couple of the most key responsibilities under the judicial branch. They can review any case on different types of reviews on any day, but what they definitely have to do is make a court order removing a child from the custody of the parents. If a child is placed out of home, the judge has to order it. And the judge's real goal is looking to see whether DCF is making what we call reasonable efforts in our work with children. So if we are making reasonable efforts towards what's called the permanency goal of returning the child home or placing the child for adoption, that's what that judge in that court system is reviewing. So that's the executive and the judicial. And then we look at prevention partners, and that's at the bottom of the first page. Our prevention partners are funded in two different ways. One is family preservation, and that's a holistic case management that kind of can address a family that might have a number of different needs. And the other is Family First Prevention Services Act, and that is specific grants under a new federal funding stream started in 2018, I believe, and that allows us to bring evidence-based programs in substance use, mental health, parent skill building, and kinship navigation to families in their homes. So that's going to be more targeted when a family has more one primary presenting problem versus a whole host of needs that we need to work together on in family pres. So that's prevention. If prevention can't work, doesn't work, or is skipped because it's an emergency situation, then we would switch to the next page. In the next page, then you have a referral to the out-of-home case management providers, and they only get a case, as I mentioned, when DCF refers after the judge has removed the child from the home. And their primary role is making sure that child has a placement that is referred to these other two boxes, referred to the child placing agencies and referred to the residential providers in our state. So there are three different pieces of the foster care system that have to work together to make sure that a child who comes into care has the place to sleep that very first night. The other case responsibility of the case management provider is reintegration services with a family, with the parents. So they are supposed to meet with the parents, engage with them to find out what their needs are, why they think the child came out of the home, and then work with them to develop a case plan that will help them work together with the provider to move their family towards improvements in substance use or mental health or housing safety towards a child being able to be returned to the home. In the meantime, we've placed a child in a family foster home, ideally, through a child placing agency. Those child placing agencies, and we'll get into this on the next set of handouts, support foster parents across the state. There are 16 different child placing agencies in Kansas that serve foster children. There are even more that serve private adoption, but that's outside of my scope of work. So the child placing agency receives referrals every night to find a place for a child to stay, if possible. For children with higher needs or for whom a family-like environment is not appropriate or available, then we have residential providers. And we did a quick count. I think it's about 80, 8 to 85, and sometimes they might be open or closed on a given day, or a new one opening or one closing, but there's about 85 different residential homes across Kansas. Those are all the child placing agencies and the residential providers and the child welfare case management providers. Those are all funded through the traditional Title IV-E child welfare dollars from the federal government down through you all and then appropriated to DCF. Excuse me. The next section talks about our Medicaid partners, and the reason that they are kind of separate is because they are managed through a separate federal funding stream, even though we need to get those services just as urgently to children. So community mental health centers with their safety net mental health approaches, they are the primary provider of foster care mental health services and for children in child welfare generally and their parents, because they are the provider that will take a child regardless of ability to pay. We also work frequently with community developmental disability organizations who, if the child has gotten eligible for IDD services and passes through the wait list, can be served by CDDOs. We frequently would work with CDDOs maybe for an older child who might have an IDD need, who's transitioning out of care. That was when I spent most of my work with CDDOs. And then also psychiatric residential treatment facilities. If a child has a real chronic, severe mental health condition such that they are not safely maintained in a family foster home or in their community, we can place them in a psychiatric residential treatment facility if there's an open bed. And the managed care organizations are the gatekeeper to whether we are approved or not approved to actually seek those mental health services on behalf of children on any given day. So I hope this 2 pages provides a sort of basic, simple, streamlined, and I know some of you know this so well, but for those of you who are new to the committee, I hope that it was worth walking through that and keeping it in a handout you can refer to in the future. The next handout is nonprofit service providers, and I struggled to figure out how to convey the complexity of the work that is done while keeping it simple. And so I hope that this document can help you see the different providers taking on different roles in different areas in their state. So you start with family pres, then you have family first prevention service providers, 4 different case management providers, the 16 child placing agencies, advocacy services, and we just picked out 2 of the residential types of facilities, the qualified residential treatment QRTPs programs, as well as the psychiatric residential treatment facilities. So what you'll see in this list of providers is that some providers do multiple activities and other providers only do one particular service in a local community. And so that can make it pretty confusing when you're looking at from the outside to try to figure out what hat is this provider wearing. And unfortunately, sometimes it just takes some digging. Even if you would call me to say, I have a child and they're in a PRTF and I heard a constituent concern, I'm going to have to go find out, is the child in a PRTF privately placed through their parent? Are they placed through foster care? If they're placed through foster care, did they have a foster home? And who's the sponsoring agency? And then even more, who's the case management provider? So you have all of these different buckets of service providers that overlap in different ways. And if I could make it more simple, I would. The reason that is not that simple is that providers, like all of us, have businesses that they start up in a local community. So if you're a provider in Newton, Kansas, that's where you're going to grow your work, and you really can only grow to the capacity that you have. So if there's any questions, of course, I'm happy to answer any of those. Finally, as I go through a little bit of a narrative of our hopeful roadmap towards an improved child welfare system, there's a number of data pieces that I've pulled out. And we thought it would be helpful to pull those out in a snapshot, because I don't know about you, but once I turned 40, I can't remember anything. So I try to have it in one place where you can refer back, so that you don't have to dig through the narrative document that I've written through to find some of these statistics. They can help support if you want to find that later. I will pause before I start into my narrative. Do you want to take questions or just keep going through? Keep going. Okay. So in the document that I've provided, I kind of wanted just to make sure you were aware of what those resources were, and we're happy to keep working on resources if you see something else that we could provide that would be helpful in the future. But at this point, I'd like to translate these basic pieces of information and the acronyms and the data points that we've provided into our proposed understanding and roadmap of continued child welfare improvement in the state. As you'll see in the data, document quickly, we have made some significant improvements in the Kansas child welfare system in recent years. We have reduced the number of overall children in care, and that has been a tremendous success and step forward with the support of this legislature and Family First Prevention Services Act grants, as well as other policies changed. We have reduced the number of children who have to be placed in foster care in Kansas. We've also increased the placement stability for most children over the recent years. However, the Children's Alliance is not satisfied with simply improving. We want to really address the issues that can be addressed in child welfare. And so we sat down this summer and I asked our teams, they said, you know, we've been thinking about child welfare kind of on our heels for some time. It feels like that we've had a number of problems, we've had media articles, and it's just very frustrating. How can we think long-term? How can we present long-term solutions to the legislature so that we can work together on things that might really help? And so I said, can you think out 5 years? Not today, not this weekend, not next month, but 5 years, and what is the most critical changes we could make? And without really any trouble, we identified 3 common goals. And one is that we need to continue safely reducing the need for foster care. The second is that we need to absolutely improve our services for youth with complex needs, both in our communities so children don't have to enter foster care, as well as once they enter our care. And finally, we can't do either one of those things until we have a child welfare workforce that's trained and retained and recruited well, so that we can assure that when we have a family working with a case manager, that case manager provides what they need. Given, I don't know what my time frame is, given the time and the other conferees that are here today, I don't want to dive too deep into these data points, but I will mention something I do want you to be aware of is that we have reduced the number of children in out-of-home care in Kansas in recent years, but in the last 10 years, we have consistently had more children out of home average than the average number of in the United States. So the United States average rate of children placed out of home is 5.6 children per 1,000. In Kansas, we've never been below, I'm gonna have to go back and look at my chart. 8.2. And so we have a ways to go to figure out why so many Kansas children are ending up in foster care to start with, and to try to reach them before they do. We think if we reduce the need for foster care, we obviously will have, by nature, know that children who needed those community supports are accessing them. We're reducing the long-term health impacts of the adverse childhood experiences that are causing children to enter foster care. We would have reduced the need for our foster care workforce, and we would have reduced the risks of negative outcomes that are associated with foster care. If you have to enter foster care, we know that you have experienced negative outcomes and negative situations in your childhood, and we also know that simply being placed out of home is not an ideal situation for any child if it can be avoided. Regarding youth with complex needs and those services, we are very concerned about those youth. As you heard in our previous joint meeting with the Corrections Committee, we're particularly interested in youth that have juvenile offender behaviors that are entering foster care. And I didn't speak too long at that committee, so I'll take just a minute today to talk about the rate of older children that are entering foster care in Kansas. I can't give you page numbers because I had to print mine in large print, but if you'll look at the one with the blue, the total number of Kansas children entering out-of-home placement by age in one fiscal year, we have almost 1,000 children over 13 referred to foster care in 1 year. What is going on with families that we would need that many teenagers to come into foster care? It's very concerning, and it is very unusual across the country. Across the country, the older you get, generally, the less likely it is that you would need to enter foster care. But we have some gaps in our community services that's really contributing to that strain and push on our demand for resources in foster care. Secondly, the key indicator, in my opinion, about knowing whether we are improving related to our services with youth with complex needs who do enter care is that foster care placement stability rate. And if you look at the graph that has the orange and the blue going this way, and this is from the year 2020, so these numbers would have improved along with our placement stability numbers that have been improving in the last couple of years. But this is the last graph that I could find. That the majority of Kansas children are experiencing relatively few changed placements. But there are 30% of foster children in Kansas experiencing multiple placement changes. And that is because we have not found a match with their needs and the available resources for family-like settings or residential care in their communities. And we need to do better to make sure that if a child is placed in foster care, it's because we can provide the services that they need. And if they're being placed in foster care and we can't provide the services that they need, we've already talked with you about the need to look for other alternatives. So sorry about my cough. We would like to see that number of youth entering care and the placement stability numbers continue to improve. Both, because by doing so, we will be more confident that our communities are meeting children where they are, that they're not escalating in the home and requiring to be placed in foster care. We will improve the morale and the retention of our foster care workforce by not being sort of charged with this choice of trying to care for a child without the resources to do so effectively. And we will avoid those negative outcomes for youth who come into foster care, but then have placement instability, which then actually worsens the very reasons and symptomology that they entered into foster care in the first place. So the youth with complex needs is one of our priority issues because we see those children as the most needing our attention. And I will just point out that the original Child Welfare Systems Task Force from 5 years ago, thanks to Representative Owsley, it was a top priority that we address the youth with complex needs at that time, and it remains a priority. Finally, we would like to look at the child welfare workforce as a long-term need, and that is not simple nor easy. I can tell you that we in Kansas and also our partner organizations nationally have been looking at workforce issues. Workforce in child welfare has been a long-standing problem. There are no simple solutions, and if you find the solutions, you will find that Kansas has tried many of them already. What we have to do is continue to think outside the box related to our workforce. So I'll come right back to the how on workforce, but first I want to make some suggested changes that we could offer, that we could use your support for from this committee. One is we will be asking our appropriations committee partners to help us ensure the workforce is stable for our PRTFs. That piece has to happen in order for children to access immediate care that they need. We also see some successes in what's called behavior interventionist programs, and those are when a child has been recommended to PRTF but has not been able to be placed there. There are some services that are showing real promising successes with keeping children safe in the home. So we'd like to see those expanded. We also need to have more respite care for families. Families should not have to enter foster care in order to feel that they have that support of respite care. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but our KDAD's partners, they have foster care for youth with intellectual disability needs and mental health needs. We can expand those without bringing the entire government oversight of foster care into those family lives. We also have our KDOC partners. They have the capacity today to increase their bed placement options for youth with juvenile offender behaviors. And they would not have to enter our foster care system and have all those negative consequences to other foster homes and foster children. Finally, we need evidence-based programming for youth with delinquency behaviors. We can do that both through DCF and through KDOC. And we need the legislature to support dollars to make sure we're really targeting our prevention services towards the youth that are really having the most needs. In our opinion, that's youth with delinquency needs. And also, a recent trend you may not have heard of, and I had not actually heard of until we started looking into it, is we are seeing more and more youth with IDD needs entering foster care simply because there's no services. There's no services, they're on a wait list, they can't get the care that they need, so they enter foster care, in which we still have the same exact availability of services that the original family did, but now the child has been removed from their original home. We would like to see DCF and KDADS work together on a pilot or model that would allow us to make sure that when a child reaches that candidacy for foster care level, that we're looking at bringing the services they need into the home, even if it doesn't meet our Medicaid waiver silo. And one last thing for youth with complex needs, we have, and thanks to DCF for leading therapeutic foster care license level development. So there's different levels of care in foster care. You can start off at a basic level, and you can go to specialized, and you can go to intensive, and then you can go all the way up to therapeutic foster care now. But we need the services around those families to make that work. Just because I sign up to be a therapeutic foster parent doesn't mean I have access to attendant care that I might need during transition times in the morning or at the end of the day after school. It doesn't mean that there's mobile crisis available to me when I really need support. It doesn't mean that there's respite care that's trained to support the youth that I've agreed to take in. So we need to wrap the therapeutic foster care around with more supports in our communities. And I think that my written testimony about how to work on the workforce is probably clear enough. We need improved technology. We need reasonable caseload sizes. We need supervisor coaching. We need to deal with secondary trauma. And we need a long-term plan, which we're working on with some of our workforce partners. So thank you for letting me go along. I hope the roadmap was not too windy. And I'm happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
We'll go ahead and take questions now, if you have any. Representative Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. On the this chart, at the top, it says that from April 2018 to December 2022, there was a reduction of roughly 1,500 kids and out-of-home situations. Can you tell me why?
I can tell you at least partially why. And I will be real clear, April 2018 was the highest number I could find, so to show you kind of when we were in the most challenging age stage. In 2018, the federal government passed the Family First Prevention Services Act, and that allowed us for the very first time to use Title IV dollars traditionally allocated only to foster care to reach families in their homes. And so we have implemented those Family First grants across the state, and almost 90% of those referrals have been able to successfully keep children in the home. That's that's what I see as the major contributing change.
Further questions? Yes, Representative Underhill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You had mentioned that we're taking in teenagers at a higher rate than other states. Are those other states locking them up, or is this a result of some of the laws that we have on the books where we don't know what to do with those teenagers, so we put them in foster care?
That's a really good question, Representative. And I have not studied every other state. I do know, for instance, Texas just doesn't take them. If you have a child that is not been a victim of maltreatment, they will just close the door and say that foster care is not appropriate. So they don't place them there. I also think that many states have not had juvenile justice reform, and so, yeah, an unfortunate number of youth are still going into detention in other states. I'm trying to think of other factors. I think that there are more community-based services earlier on in other states as well. It's not, Family First is a wonderful innovative approach, but it is pretty narrow. You have to have evidence-based, and it has to be meeting the federal standards, and there has to be research associated to it. But for instance, the idea about serving IDD youth in their homes, that wouldn't be fundable through Family First, so we would need to use state general fund dollars to do that. And some states' Medicaid programs are much more robust.
Representative Ousley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Rachel. Just to kind of follow up on that, it's always been my understanding Kansas is one of the only states that removes for non-abuse neglect. And is that kind of what you were hinting to in Texas, in that if it's not abuse, then they just don't bring the kid into the system?
Correct. And I do have that information currently buried in my email. I'd have to get the details of how they've limited those numbers. But yeah, that's generally the approach. If it's not child maltreatment, abuse, or neglect, they just simply don't bring, like for instance, you don't bring a child with truancy behaviors into foster care in many states.
If I may just comment, that's always been something I've wanted to explore more. And depending upon who you're speaking with, some people cringe at the thought of not taking that preemptive measure and removing that child, and other people think, why are we removing them? So it's not been a real thorough discussion, but it's always one I'm interested in. So thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Humphries.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just to quickly to piggyback off of that, I thought that was what some of the Family First funds, that we had to focus on maltreatment and that we wouldn't be removing just for neglect. Is that true? So we have moved in that direction.
Absolutely. I think our
Okay.
1,500 reduction in number of children out of home reflects a significant improvement. I was just really stunned when I realized that the rate still is high above the rest of the country, even after that improvement was made.
Okay. Okay. And then my other question has to do with the IT. That's kind of your first long-term solution was to, and so, you know, we had that discussion yesterday. Or was that yesterday? Monday, sorry. These two committees look, we do similar things. So, and so do you, you know, would you say, and I know, of course, you have to be careful and all of that kind of thing, but would you say 5 years is reasonable for us to get that in place? I mean, do you see any way for to have a well-designed information system in place sooner than that? Or can you help us make suggestions?
Thank you for that question. I really appreciate the question and I appreciate the attention. What I can tell you is that the Child Welfare Task Force 5 years ago placed data and information sharing as a critical and high priority, and here we are today and we still don't have it. I do not speak IT, and so what I have tried to do is begin asking DCF when will we see the data system improve, because we are using multiple data systems. Social workers, there's just simple things. Like I have an app for like trying to sleep at night, but a social worker can't use an app in the field. There are things that we should be able to do with technology that would make their lives easier, and we're just not doing that yet. However, I don't understand fully the complexity of how it looks to actually implement. And so what I think that is important is that you're asking the question and that we're moving forward. I can say a couple of years ago, I had to ask in the Appropriations Committee, where's the money coming for this? And it just didn't seem that it was really getting started. So I'm glad that we're at least working on it.
Yep. Very diplomatic. That was that's good, but I think you're right. We just have to keep asking the questions. And I think I had one other thing, but I don't know what it was. So that'll do me. Thank you. That was really helpful. Appreciate it. Mm-hmm.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The IT issue, I will tell you, it's my understanding, and I have attended a presentation on a possible type of program that would be exactly what we would need to facilitate information between a number of sources and that can take them from different sources. So I know that's being explored and will be introduced possibly in a bill within the next time period, may even come through here. And I'm very pleased to know that we're working on that because, you know, I am so technologically advanced. Paperless. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Ousley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I hate to keep commenting, but the Child Welfare Task Force, when we were talking about that C-SWIS, the feasibility study, just that alone was a tremendous task and a tremendous price tag, if I recall right. DCF is the largest data housing department that we have in the state. And they were, the way it was described to us on that task force was, you know, they're next to just out of a shoebox with the technology that they're using. So though it may appear like nothing's happened, I'm pretty confident that quite a bit started underneath the last administration and has continued work under this administration. I would love to see it done. I'd love to see it where law enforcement and DCF have, direct shareable access. I think that could improve things tremendously. But just for the committee's interest.
Okay, further questions? Okay, thanks for being here and for the presentation and the information, and we really appreciate it. Okay, next we will shift gears and have hear the annual report of the Child Death Review Board. We have Jane Weiler. Did I say that right, Weiler? Ah, well, welcome to committee.
Thank you. Representative Kincannon and all members, I'm Jane Weiler. I'm an Assistant Attorney General. I was just recently appointed to be the chairperson for the Child Death Review Board. We've been asked to come in and provide some information, but I just wanted to start out to let you know as to what the goals are for the Child Death Review. And this provides just kind of a framework of what we're looking for, is to describe the trends and patterns of child deaths, trying to identify some risk factors, improve interagency communication. I mean, that's between all state agencies, law enforcement, the pathologists that complete autopsies, and then to try to develop prevention strategies to, one less child death review that we have to review would be great. And then also who's on this committee, because this is by statute. It's a multidisciplinary team. There's one member from the Attorney General's office, and they serve as the chairperson. The director of the KBI appoints someone, the Secretary for Children and Family, and the Secretary for Health and Environment appoints someone. The Board of Healing Arts appoints 3. One is a coroner, and 2 are licensed medical doctors. One is a pathologist, and the other is a pediatrician. And then the Attorney General's office also appoints an individual to represent advocacy groups. And then lastly, the District Attorneys Association appoints a member to be representative. Since 1994, the Child Death Review Board has reviewed over 1,200 deaths that have occurred in Kansas, and these are children in Kansas and then other children that might be in Kansas that do pass away. We provided you the 2022 annual report. This includes all of the child fatalities from 2020. And this information is compiled in the fall time, and so the 2021 will be available by October 1st. So this is why it might look like we're handing you something old, but it's just the review process that goes into it. And that was provided with the information. For 2020, there were 365 total child deaths that were reviewed. 197 were natural, and these were, prematurity, have cancers, other diseases, and that's 54%. I don't know which way you like to have your numbers. 63 were unintentional deaths. That can include like your motor vehicles, your asphyxiation, and other non-intentional, and that's 17%. There were 22 homicides, and that does also include child abuse and gang-related deaths, and so that's 6%. There were 26 suicides, and that was 70% of those 365. And then lastly is 57 that are undetermined, which is 16%. This can be, this is the information provided that the review board could not come up with the potential of what the cause was that fits into the other manners of death. And these manners of death, these are what you would find like on a death certificate. So this isn't anything that the board's doing outside of what the pathologist checks, but we do review to see if there is different information that was not provided, or maybe there was something missed in the investigation. Just kind of an overview of the information that's in the 2020 Death Review Board about the males were pretty much leading in all of the categories, and they were a total of 59% of the 365 deaths. And in 2020, they started looking back to see if COVID had any bearing on this. There were 2 that did test positive for COVID. One was more related to the unsafe sleeping environment. And so the board, when they reviewed it, just classified it as an undetermined, a sudden unexpected infant death. There was, though, one individual who did have a natural death related to the COVID-19, and that was in 2020. Probably one significant thing that was found is that in 2020, there were 11 deaths related to fentanyl. Prior to that, there had never been a death related to fentanyl. So in 2020, that was all suddenly ticks onto the, in the reviews. There was 1 methamphetamine death in 2020. There was 3 in 2019. There was a drop noted in the suicides. But overall, it's just a matter of, we still have 365 that are out there. But what the board has looked to, that they would just like for legislative priorities, would like to recommend an improvement to the child welfare system to include medical evaluations for children when there are concerns for child abuse. And this is by someone, a pediatrician who is trained in child abuse investigation, or some type of a pediatric healthcare provider who is trained in with specialized training. And then lastly would be to address the child care licensing laws, to provide some increased monitoring for compliance with the current laws, as well as to address the penalties and for prosecution of having an unlicensed child care facility. In 2020, there were 2 deaths that did occur in an unlicensed child care location. And I stand for any questions.
Well, thank you for being here and for your report. Just to follow up, we actually have a bill called the Care Network that provides for those exams, the training for the physicians to perform those exams across the state. We've had a hearing on it and haven't worked the bill yet, but we had it last year, and the bill passed the House but didn't make it completely through the process. So we're hoping to get it through this year. I wish we'd have thought to reach out to you. We could have had another proponent for that bill, but I appreciate you mentioning it as a recommendation. Committee, do you have questions? Yes, Representative Neighbor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mine is more of a point of clarification. When you were talking about the numbers on page 1, you said 1,200 births, but you've written 12,000. I just wanted to make sure it was 12,000. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Further questions? Representative Ousley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the update. On the fentanyl deaths, is the geographic area documented in the report? Did that all come from one area of the state, or is that scattered throughout the state?
That I'm going to ask Sarah Hortenstein if she's familiar with that question. Sarah Hortenstein's actually the executive director for the Child Death Review Board, and I don't know if, I have no idea.
Sarah, if you could just identify yourself.
Yes, Sarah Hortenstein. I serve as Executive Director for the State Child Death Review Board. 2020 was the first year that we had the significant rise in our fentanyl deaths. With such a low number, that is not something we would report out geographically. If we had more years to compare, I think that would provide more anonymity to the children where that was experienced. But as more years of this information is reported out, there will be more opportunity to describe those trends at community levels. So.
And that makes sense. Thank you for that response. I only asked because I fear we're just seeing the beginning of a rising trend in that statistic. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to commend the work that you're doing with this. From my experience in criminal justice, law enforcement, and my time working with, this is an incredible tool for law enforcement. And I know last year as many copies of this as I could get out of you folks, I hand delivered to different police agencies, and everyone welcomed this information. I also represent Wyandotte County, and I'm very pleased with their taking steps to have some additional review. Until we study it, then we don't know how to combat it. And I just commend you many times over. Thank you very much.
Further questions? Representative Lewis.
I'm going to ask a question that I doubt you're going to be able to answer, but it's on everybody's mind, is what do we do about the fentanyl problem?
I do know that Attorney General Kobach has highlighted that as one of his big priorities for both his office and for the legislation. I don't know what has been introduced. It's something, I mean, when we are just all of a sudden noticing it, it is a problem.
Thank you.
Back in 2018 or 19, I can't remember. We passed a bill that allowed for communication with law enforcement. Do you remember that? Has that been a benefit to you?
I don't think they're having too much trouble getting the information from law enforcement.
I
mean,
I think, yeah, Sarah, I think the communication was more from the board back to law enforcement, so.
Yeah, so with the exception and the statutory changes that allow us to give that information back to law enforcement when there is information that's been provided to the board that maybe law enforcement wasn't aware of at the time of their investigation, that is something that we are still able to do. To my knowledge, there has not been criteria that has met where we've needed to relay that information. But moving forward, I do anticipate that that could happen from time to time.
So, for example, if it was discovered during your investigation that you believe it was a homicide previous to our legislation, you could not relay that back to law enforcement, correct?
Not to law enforcement. We did have some provisions when it came to exceptions that we could provide information to a county or a district attorney when there was information that there was a death as a result to abuse or neglect. We did have certain provisions where we could inform the county attorney that there may have been information that we've obtained that they might want to investigate. Then they could work with local law enforcement to maybe address that situation. Now we have the ability to connect with them as well as law enforcement to discuss information they may not have had. So it is absolutely appreciated.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Representative Wagner.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Your figure 4 statistics on undetermined, I guess undetermined as to, is most of this just as far as infants, whether it was A or B? It's not like whether it was suicide versus homicide or undetermined unintentional injury versus, motor vehicle versus non-motor vehicle. Is that all? I mean, it's a pretty good, 60, almost 60 of your cases are undetermined. Is that all on the natural causes side, or is any of that on the other side?
if there is indication of that it would be a natural death or it would be an accidental death. That's where you would pick one or the other. The undetermined, that's the ones that you don't know. A lot of like unsafe sleeping surfaces might fall into that because of like with a sudden unexpected infant death, formerly known as SIDS. That's coming in, that used to be its own determination, but now it comes under the undetermined because there's no way to 100% pick what the problem was that caused a sudden unexplained infant death. Is that what the answer?
Kind of. I mean, so it's basically it's sort of related to, it's some sort of version of a natural death. It's not, there's no suspected homicide or no suspected child abuse. It's really, you just can't quite pinpoint whether it was SIDS or something else that caused the child to die.
Correct.
Am I reading that correctly?
Because some of them, it's like the unsafe sleeping area. I mean, it's not that once law enforcement's there doing an investigation, it might look like it was possibly an unsafe sleeping area, whereas with which you might have some type of indication on an autopsy. However, when the autopsy is completed, the autopsy doesn't find that particular, if they're looking for signs of smothering or something. And so then, because you have a maybe, we're calling it undetermined. We're not calling it an absolute accidental death because of the unsafe sleeping. So it depends on, it's the totality of everything that occurs for the investigation, for the pathology reports. So everything is looked at.
I think that's helpful. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Representative Howerton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could you give an example of an unintentional injury?
Motor vehicle accident?
Okay, that's that.
So an accident, yeah, something without intent, a fall, a drowning can be an unintentional.
What category would a child being abandoned, like put into a trash container or something like that? What would that fall under?
That should fall under, I mean, it depends on what kind of information we had, but, you know, hypothetically, what the information, if somebody were to intentionally abandon that intent then can go to a homicide.
Okay. And were there any of those in 2020?
I don't believe we had any, you mean specifically like an abandoned baby? Because there were some children that there was homicide that did relate from child abuse, but that was more.
Yeah, I was just looking for abandonment.
Abandonment. I don't believe so. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Hortenstein said no.
Further questions? Okay, thank you. Thanks for being here, and we always appreciate having a look at this and showing some trends. Okay, we're going to go out of order, and next up we'll have Carrie Leonard from Division of the Child Advocate with her annual report, and she, I know, addressed it a little bit when you came and gave your introduction, but while we were doing some reports today, I wanted to give another opportunity to have a little more thorough look at your annual report. So welcome back.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Madam Chair, Vice Chair, and Ranking Minority Member, and members of the committee. I'm happy to join you this afternoon. I am Carrie Leonard, and I serve as the Kansas Child Advocate. Hopefully you have, I know everyone's paperless, so hopefully you have the presentation, which is essentially some slides trying to summarize, sorry, Representative Johnson, some slides really summarizing the annual report, which had been previously sent. If you do not have a copy of the full annual report, it is located on our website under reports. If you also have trouble locating that, just let me know, and I'm more than happy to either provide you a direct link or provide a hard copy. The Division of the Child Advocate was created in October of 2021 by Executive Order 2127 and 2128. I joined the division in December. I came to this role after about 14 years or so working as an attorney, both doing a lot of child welfare work, as a parent's attorney, as a guardian ad litem, representing foster parents and other family members. Prior to that, I worked as a social worker and had been at one point in time a CASA volunteer. And so child welfare has really been really a key part of my professional path. And so working to develop this division is really close to my heart, and I hope that we can continue to build it and meet the needs here in Kansas. The mission and purpose and really function of the division is to look at our child welfare policies, our procedures, how we're doing as a system in meeting our children and family needs from an independent review, and really looking at the evaluation and concerns that are voiced by our children, families, and other individuals. Really, the hope of our office is also to be able to provide and be a resource to you so that as constituents come to you with questions and concerns that you may not know where to guide them or lead them or how to address, then we want to make sure that we can be a resource for those individuals. So shifting to page 4 or slide 4, really just as a quick look and summary of what has occurred over this last year, since we've only been in existence for essentially 1 year. And that is started with developing a new division from the ground up and hiring staff. And so I'm very proud of our team. And we recently pulled together and looked at the number of years that all of us in combined have in child welfare services. And we have 70 plus years amongst a team of 5. And so I do think that we bring a good perspective and experience into this role. From there, we worked on establishing a physical office. So under the Executive Order of 2127, it created the Office of Public Advocates. So now we are housed along with the Long-Term Care Ombudsman and the Can Care Ombudsman. As we're building the office, hiring staff, working with the different child welfare systems and agencies and players, we started receiving complaints and concerns. And so that's been a process, is building a new division while still trying to meet the needs of our citizens. And that's been a learning process, and one that we hope to continue to develop and evolve. We also wanted to, along with really building partnerships with our system providers, and I think that Rachel Marsh with the Children's Alliance did an excellent job, hopefully outlining and trying to simplify a very, very complex system, and looking at all of the number of entities and the individuals that are meeting and working with our children and families. So just to talk about where our office comes from, we receive complaints from any individual. It can be from the child themselves, it can be from constituent services, a legislator may send someone to us, it can be a parent, a foster parent, a grandparent, a guardian ad litem, it can be the case manager who's working on the case. And one of the most important things is that we want to make sure that we ensure confidentiality of those that are brave enough to share their stories and bring their complaints or concerns to us. We also, we don't represent that individual's position. And so I think that's really important, is that when you're looking at a child in need of care case and everything that's involved, there's a lot of narratives, and we are not representing the person who's necessarily come to us, but we're looking at children and family well-being and best practices. And so we're wanting to make sure that we're wearing that we're coming from a place of independence, and we're wearing the lens of neutrality when we're looking at a case or concern. Looking at slide 6, or page 6, Investigations that come to us fall into three main categories. The first one is a case-specific investigation, and that means that someone's come to us and shared with us a particular story or concern involving a child or family. A second example would be a systemic investigation, and that's looking at a particular either problematic pattern that we're hearing or seeing, a particular area or region. So for example, in the annual report in the actual annual report on page 14, you'll see just a little case example of a case-specific investigation. And then on page 13 of that annual report, you'll see an example of a systemic investigation where we had received several different concerns in a particular area and service provider, but it was unrelated families, unrelated children. And so we're looking at that area to see what is going on systemically in that particular region. We also have a KDCA-initiated investigation, and that's one that if we're starting to hear and identify patterns ourselves, then we may initiate a more intensive investigation and looking at what's going on. Along with looking at actual investigations, we do receive a number of folks that contact us, which really their concerns, their questions are out of scope. So under our current executive order, it is any child who is alleged to be a child in need of care or adjudicated as a child in need of care. But we may have someone who contacts us who may have a domestic issue that's going on, a custody issue, or it may be a child care issue that they're dealing with. And our goal is still to provide as many resources and information as we can. So we do work really hard to try to locate resources, contacts for those individuals so that we're not just another entity who may be telling them, sorry, we can't help. Although, unfortunately, we do have to tell folks that it may be out of scope. But if we can give that warm handoff, then that is our goal. If you look at page 7, it does provide you a map of Kansas, and this is using the DCF region and area map, and identifies the case management providers that you've received information on, and I think you've met many of those folks. And Ms. Marsh's presentation also gives you, I think, a rundown of those. But that provides you just a quick snapshot of the numbers of formal complaints that we have received based on the different areas. And so I do, when you look at the larger numbers, we have a large number out of Sedgwick County, but we have a higher population there. And so as we're continuing to hear concerns, we are looking for those patterns and if there are systemic concerns that we need to be addressing with the agencies. At this point for 2022, we had 165 formal complaints involving 321 children. On page 8, you'll just see the number of complaints that we've received based on the month. And so you'll see a spike in May and then a spike in November. And, as we move forward into 2023, we'll continue to track that information as we receive complaints and address those issues. As we looked at the spike in May that we had in April, the prior month, we had initiated our social media and had been sending letters. So I do think that we had been sharing information with folks so that they knew about our division. On page 9, it's just a quick graph of the most common complaint reasons received in 2022. The annual report provides you much more detail in regards to what those complaint reasons are, but that is just a quick snapshot of the main areas of complaint reasons that we're receiving. So some takeaways from that are common themes. Nothing new for this group or any of those that have been listening to the testimony provided just in the last couple of weeks. We know that there's a workforce crisis and that there are a lot of initiatives and focus on improving that workforce. A lot of what we're hearing in our division, I think, can be attributed to the workforce crisis and some of those case management challenges, whether it's based on proper training, supervision, support, the caseload balance. The other piece is just access to the community resources, the mental health supports and services. We're continuing to hear that our families and our parents are struggling with access to the appropriate services. And then when children are entering into care, we're hearing from our foster parents and our relative caregivers that there's just a lack of community supports and services for their children and families. And I think all of those things play into our placement stability that we're struggling with. It's challenging to maintain placement if you're not being provided the services that you need in order to care for the child in your home. Page 10, it just quickly looks at the policy and practice considerations from the annual report that we provided. Again, prevention. If we can continue to reduce the number of youth and children that are coming into care, then I think we'll naturally address some of the other issues. And that's looking at focusing on upstream, continuing those early intervention services for our families and within the communities. And then if you look at page 11, it's looking at moving forward, and so looking at 2023 and beyond. So the first thing is that as a new division, we are critically looking at our processes and how we are responding to the concerns that are being brought to us, and we want to make sure that we're being proactive in evolving our responses. And so one of those things that we know is that we want to focus on improving our timelines in working the complaints. So there's been a lot of discussion, and even earlier, I think Representative Humphreys and others have voiced the questions about the IT. And so that's been a challenge for our division, is accessing information directly from whether it's the Department for Children and Families or all of those other private providers that you've been learning so much about, and all the players. And it is difficult to get information to make sure that you have a full record and that you are understanding what is happening in the case. And that's a challenge, looking and pulling information from different databases. And so continuing to focus on and supporting the Department for Children and Families and working towards getting a more comprehensive individualized, robust IT system, I think is important. And I think that will help all of the players and services and those workers. When we talk about workforce, it will make them much more effective and efficient in their roles. The other piece that we're looking at is not just timeliness, but just our processes and the level of what our investigations look like. So some of our investigations can be pretty intense and take some time to really look into what's going on. But we also want to make sure and identify, and this is something that we're looking at more closely, is where along in the case can we be stronger advocates more immediately with what's happening. And so whether that's making phone calls, having meetings, attending different whether it's best interest staffing or a team decision-making meeting with a family, then we're trying to identify those earlier on. We also want to improve our outreach. We continue to hear that not everyone knows that we're in existence, which is fair after only being in existence a year. But we do want to continue to focus on that in 2023. Two other really main projects that we're working on is last year, back in October, the Joint Committee on Child Welfare Systems Oversight, there had been some concerns and discussion regarding the number of foster families that were leaving and no longer being licensed. And it was a pretty significant number. And so we worked to initiate a survey of those families, and we had some preliminary results. At this point, we had a very large number of respondents who provided us direct contact information to get more information, to really talk with them about what their experiences were and what information and feedback they have to share. So that's what we're working on next, so that hopefully we can pull all of that information together and provide some, I think, important feedback for you all, as well as our child placing agencies and our case management providers. The second project that we have really started is initiating some dialogue around the best interest staffings that we hear a lot about. That's an agency process where they identify who the adoptive resource family will be for the permanency option for the child or children. There's a lot of questions about that process. There's also just some questions procedurally within how the agency is operating, how that's impacting our case management providers, and what the judicial oversight looks like as to that process. And so we're starting some dialogue and looking at those cases, so hopefully we can provide some important feedback for others who are looking at that. And finally, we went to, in 2023 and beyond, is work to also be just a forum for collaboration. You hear from a lot of different individuals and groups that are wanting to improve our child and family well-being. And if we, as the Division of the Child Advocate, can provide a central location or a forum for that information and make sure that that dialogue and communication and information is being shared, then we want to try to do that as well. And finally, I just want to make sure that we really do acknowledge and thank all of the individuals and groups and community members and players that are working to serve our children and families. And so the last page is just a list. It's a long list, and it's not a complete list, but I do want to make sure that we really think about that when we think about child and family well-being and child welfare, it's not just DCF, or it's not just the case management provider. It's our foster families, it's our relatives, it's our mental health providers, it's our schools, it's our faith organizations, our community advocates. So I think it's important that we recognize that it's going to be a village to improve our systems and working together in that capacity. And on the last page is just our contact information. Feel free to reach out to our division. I'm more than happy to share more information about what we're doing. If you have questions or if you have constituent concerns, we're more than happy to work with you and your constituents to address those concerns. And Madam Chair, I'm happy to stand for questions.
Okay, great. Committee, do you have questions? Yeah, Representative Underhill.
So, thank you, Madam Chair. Going through the complaints and that sort of thing, so what authority does your group have? So, the 17 unprofessional conduct complaints, you investigate them, 15 of them, there's some merit to them. So what happens next? Or, how do you guys handle that, or discipline, or how does that work with the private partners?
So our authority, and that's a question that we receive quite a bit, is what authority do you have? So as we're looking at those cases, we're providing information and feedback directly to the agencies so that they can look at their own workforce and staff and address those internally through whatever their human relations process is. If it's a licensure issue, we may be referring something to the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board if they're licensed. If it's an attorney issue, then we oftentimes refer people or we would refer back to the Kansas Attorney Disciplinary Administrator. And really it's looking at the systems as a whole. If there's unprofessional conduct, what is playing into that? Is it lack of training? Is it lack of supervision? Is it what is happening? Is it too large a caseloads? So that we can hopefully then make a difference in improving things moving forward.
Just to follow up on that, if the whoever has reported to you is uncomfortable with sharing the information like back to the provider, then do you not address it, or how's that handled?
So we always encourage individuals to be the direct reporter. If they feel unsafe or uncomfortable doing so, then we would have a conversation with them. Do you feel comfortable with us moving forward with reporting that and keeping that information as to who may have brought it to us confidential? On top of that, I have licensed social workers on staff, and so they also have their own rules of ethics that they may feel compelled based on their own ethics that they would have to report, and as well as I would as an attorney. So under my ethics, I would also potentially, as an attorney, have the obligation to report if I learn something about a licensed attorney.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, Representative Howerton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Does your jurisdiction, or can you investigate courts if there's a complaint against a court system? And I'm not referring to that, actually. I have a friend who just went through this, and DCF agreed, foster parents agreed, everybody agreed, and then the judge made an alternate ruling, which is not the case in the news. That's two cases that this has happened.
I think it happens more than we think. So investigating the court directly, no. When we look at the court as a part of the system, We are looking at how are things moving in the court? How are those statutes being applied as far as the process? Again, if it's an ethical concern, then we're going to direct them to the Kansas Disciplinary Administrator for attorneys, as well as those that investigate the judicial branch and our judges.
So, follow-up, if people could file a complaint with your office?
If they have a concern about the court as a system and how it's interplaying. Yes, but as far as the ethics are concerned, we would most likely refer them to the body that is investigating. So we would investigate. So let me give you an example. So if the family who is concerned about the process and how the judicial process worked, along with how it operated within working with our Department for Children and Families and our case management providers, we would be looking at the process as a whole and how those systems interplayed. If there's a particular issue with a judge, then we would direct them to the entity that would be looking at that judge and their ethics. Does that answer that question? Okay.
And I do appreciate the question, even though I kind of laughed at you. But I've had other calls that have been directed to me that have questioned the judgment. Other questions, Representative Wagner.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. No, just one or two kind of protocol questions, and I'm really not trying to put you on the spot, but I do remember originally the Office of Child Advocate, there would have been like a bill in the House or Senate or something had been either partially passed or something, and then the governor did it on her own through an executive order. I guess with an executive order, where does the money come from? I mean, don't we have to authorize expenditures? Are you just out of the Department of Administration budget, or how do you get your funding?
At this point, we're under state general funds.
Okay. Okay. So you are actually specifically in the budget listed Department of or
with the Department of Administration.
Okay. Fair enough. Thank you.
Representative Carr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is with respect to the caseload, and I understand Madam Chair was presenting something later regarding that, but give me an idea of just what the caseload looks like for when you're with respect to the investigation. What does that caseload look like for the individual or individuals that are charged with that function?
So Representative Carr, if I make sure I understand the question, are you asking if it's a St. Francis, are you asking about the St. Francis case manager potentially and what their caseload would look like, or KBC's, or are you asking about what our office's caseload looks like?
Well, if I understand correctly, and if I'm not, then clarify, what your caseload would look like would then, in essence, waterfall down to what like St. Francis's caseload would look like. Am I wrong in that assumption, or?
So let me, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question, Representative, so jump in and correct me if I'm going down the wrong path. So a case manager has X number of cases that they're working. And I think each entity may define that a little bit differently depending on sibling groups and things like that. If a complaint comes to us, then we are, if it's involving a particular child or a particular sibling group or family, then we are looking at just that child's case. And then we're going to be gathering information and working with the different individuals that are, whether it's a case manager or provider, the child placing agency, the guardian ad litem, mental health providers, and looking at the services that are being provided to that child and family.
Okay, so with respect to that, in regards to a time frame in which that investigation would then take place, what are we looking at there?
From our division?
From your division, yes.
So I think it depends on what the concern is, number one. I think it depends on the number of children and individuals that are involved. You're going to get the natural attorney response, but it depends. And, and also really the length of time and at what point is that concern coming to us? So if it's coming to us right at the time that that child is coming into custody, the amount of information that we're looking at is a lot less. The number of individuals that we may be wanting to talk with and look at it may be a lot less. If it's a child who has been in the custody for 3, 4, 5 years, that's a lot of information to go through and look at and can take quite some time. But again, as I pointed out, that is an area that, as a new division, now that we have our first year under our belts and some processes in place, we know that that's an area that that we're working on and have tasked ourselves with improving.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Further questions? Representative Ousley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Leonard, for being here. In your comments, you said that you had received how many complaints on how many children?
So we have received 165 formal complaints on 321 children in 2022.
On 300 and how many?
321.
Well, thank you, and thank you for providing the map also. I think it displays that people are becoming aware of your division and allow you to do good work all over the state. So thank you, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, thank you for coming back. I think not only did we get more in-depth on the annual report, but also the opportunity to ask questions that we didn't have before. So thank you.
Thank you.
So we have just a few minutes left, and I had moved Natalie to the end since she's with us every day. I think we'll go ahead and dive in because we're running out of days. So Natalie, you don't have to go fast, but you just make us late for our next committee. So this is Natalie, this is Natalie Nelson, and she's giving the report from the Joint Committee on Child Welfare Systems Oversight. So,
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. As Chairperson Kincannon said, I'm Natalie Nelson, Principal Research Analyst for the Legislative Research Department, and I staff this committee, of course, which I hope you've noticed by now, but I also staff the Joint Committee on Child Welfare System Oversight, and I've done so since January 2022. So just a bit of brief history for some of the newer legislators on this committee. The Oversight Committee was established by legislation enacted in 2021. So in the 2021 interim, the Joint Committee met 4 times, or for 2 times with 2-day meetings. And then that year, there was around 15 recommendations and 3 suggested bill introductions to the 2022 legislature. And I would just note that the report of that interim committee is on our website, which is, and in addition to that report, we have the 2023 Legislature Interim Committee Report, which is what I'm going to focus on today. And that you should have received that in your electronic testimony. I don't have a paper copy for you guys, but it looks like this. If you, okay. So in general terms, the committee's enabling statute requires that a report be submitted to the legislature that include recommended changes to current laws, rules and regulations, and policies regarding the safety and well-being of children in the child welfare system in Kansas. And the statute also identifies 9 distinct items to review, plus a catch-all, any other topic the committee deems appropriate. So it's a pretty broad stuff that you guys can study. The committee, so this year, the committee met for a 1-day meeting in April, for a 2-day meeting in September, a 1-day meeting in October, and a 2-day meeting in November. So rather going through each meeting's activities, I think I'll just summarize the types of presentations that we heard. Each meeting we heard would generally open with public comment, and that would usually be like foster parents, adoptive parents, providers, and other organizations just regarding their individual experiences with the child welfare system. We had a host of informational briefings from service providers, agencies, and other stakeholders. We had updates from DCF on specific topics as requested, and then we also had data from case management providers regarding performance outcomes, worker retention, caseloads, and other initiatives that the organization offer. And then also we had those annual reports that were relevant to the Joint Committee. The October meeting was called for the purpose of allowing committee members to follow up on a case that came to the committee's attention through testimony presented at the September meeting, that testimony was from a husband and wife who experienced issues with DCF and a case management provider in their attempt to adopt a child that they had cared for since infancy. Relevant stakeholders appeared at that meeting, and committee members were able to ask questions regarding the case in executive session, since case was still an open sync case at the time. So now I'm going to tell you about the actual recommendations that were made by the Joint Committee. And if you have the report in front of you, they're all in the gray box in the second page of the report. So in addition to the proposed legislation that this committee heard on Monday, HB 2024, regarding the newborn safety devices, the Joint Committee made the following recommendations. There was a suggestion for funding for expansion for the Safe Families for Children program to increase funding to expand the program in the McPherson, Fort Riley, and Manhattan areas in fiscal year 2024. The legislature should review and consider legislation relating to a foster parent's Bill of Rights, as was originally introduced by the late Representative Gail Finney in 2022. A bill amending the definition of kinship care placement in the revised code for the care of children to encompass the definition of a kinship caregiver that's found in Texas statute should be introduced. That came up during foster parent testimony in the November meeting. A bill codifying the budget proviso, authorizing the care provider network pilot program should be introduced, which we have heard that bill as well. That came up during testimony in September. The next recommendation is one that was from last year, actually. It was renewed, I guess, from last year's report, which is governor and legislature should collaborate to reach a consensus on a bill during the 2023 legislative session that would establish a true, independent, and transparent office of the child advocate. The next is about funding for community mental health centers for the purpose of developing school-age mental health programs in the Boys and Girls Clubs of Kansas. Also came up in testimony in November. The next one is about a judicial council report that has since been published, but this recommendation said that the committee should review that report. And that report is about the consideration of attachment in the selection of an adoptive resource for a child in need of care. And just a bit of context for that, there was a bill introduced and passed by the House Children and Seniors Committee last year, HB 2700. But subsequent to that, Representative Humphreys and Representative Kincannon requested judicial council to further study that issue. And so, like I said, that report has been was published as of December of 2022. Next one is about caseworker. Legislature should explore codifying caseworker accredited standard caseloads in statute and add a statutory cap. And that was also a renewed recommendation from the 2022 report. Then the next one is the law enforcement agencies should develop best practices to minimize emotional harm to a child when a sync case requires an officer to physically remove a child from his or her home. And that came up in the public comment section in testimony in November. I think there was some talk about a removal that was perhaps traumatic for a child because there was lights and sirens going off when that removal took place. The legislature should appropriate $350,000 for local CASA programs in FY 2024, and then between $60,000 and $75,000 should be appropriated for the statewide CASA Association in that same year. Then the last two is local CASA programs should enhance their recruitment efforts of minority advocate applicants and should increase their approval rates of minority advocate applicants. And then last but not least, this committee, meaning the Joint Committee on Oversight, should review any data that exists regarding the impact of fentanyl on youth in foster care. So I know that was very fast, but take any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions regarding the report?
Woohoo.
You did a pretty good job of getting through it. Thank you for doing that. Okay, let's see. We've got some minutes that you've received in your email from January 18th. We have not received any corrections via response on email. Does anyone have any comment or corrections at this point? Okay. Representative Johnson moved to accept the minutes. Representative Neighbor seconds. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. Minutes are approved. Okay, thank you, everybody. We're adjourned till Monday.